Okay, let's get into the structure of the kidney. The kidney has two very distinct regions. If we look at a cross-section of the kidney, what we would see is this border area. This is called the cortex of the kidney. And then there's the more internal regions. This is called the renal medulla. Let's just take a look at a close-up of this section right here. So looking at the cortex and the medulla. In the cortex, we have these interesting little structures. We're going to be talking about these in a lot of detail. The nephrons are the functional units of the kidney, so we'll come back to those in a little bit. Within the renal medulla, each of these sort of triangular shapes is referred to as a pyramid. The pyramids are separated by a column. So we'll be referring to renal pyramids and columns. That's just referring to sort of the different sections within the renal medulla. Each pyramid, so the nephrons are the locations where urine is formed, and then those drain into, down here, this is called a calyx. This is a minor calyx. Let's switch back over to this picture. So we've got a minor calyx right there. Here's another minor calyx, and let me switch to a laser pointer, it works a little better. Okay, so this pyramid drains into this minor calyx, this pyramid drains into this minor calyx. Those two merge together into a major calyx. So the plural of calyx is calyces. You might see that as we go forward or as you read the textbook. And the urine drains into that calyx and then into the renal pelvis. That's this main body down here. And then ultimately the urine would leave through the ureter. So let's focus in on the nephron in just a minute. Okay, let's start this one from the beginning. Here's where blood enters into the kidney. It enters through the renal artery. The renal artery branches out all over the place inside of the kidney, and it carries the blood out to the cortex. That's where the nephrons are at, more than 1 million nephrons. They're all going to be working hard to filter that blood. So we are going to, let's just follow this renal artery. We're going to follow it up to right here. Here is a nephron. This is the one we're going to look at for an example. So the artery, once it branches out into smaller and smaller sections, those blood vessels get thinner and thinner. We're talking about an arteriole at this point. It's just a small artery. The afferent arteriole is the one that enters the glomerulus, afferent arterioles. Okay, so here's an afferent arteriole. It's carrying blood into the glomerulus. The glomerulus is just a capillary bed, and that's the first site where filtration happens for the blood. We'll come back to that in just a minute. For now, we're just trying to follow the pathway that blood takes. So it branches out into this capillary bed called the glomerulus. Then it continues on through the efferent arteriole. This is the one that's leaving the glomerulus. Efferent arteriole. From there, look at this, it branches out again into this whole capillary network down here. So another capillary bed. These are called the peritubular capillaries. The reason for that is because they are next to or on the side of the tubes of the nephron. So see in yellow, see this tube that wraps around and then it forms a loop right here. This is a very characteristic structure for a nephron. And these blood vessels are wrapped around that tube. That's for a reason. We're going to come back to that a little bit later on as well. So blood travels through these peritubular capillaries, converges back together into a vein, and eventually it leaves the kidney through the renal vein. So the specific structures I would like for you to know are the ones that are in bold here. Those are the ones that we will be needing to refer back to later on. So the nephron structure, we're going to get into quite a bit of detail about what's going on in this nephron. We've got to be really familiar with the structure in order to do that. This is something you'll want to spend some time with. Nephron structure, get that down so that when we move on to talking about how it filters the blood, we'll be able to use those words. You should know what a glomerulus is, for example, in order for it to make any sense. So let's talk about the nephron structure in more detail. So the glomerulus, that's this thing right here. This is the site where blood first enters into the nephron. And that glomerulus, see how it is surrounded by this sort of cup-shaped thing? That's called the capsule. And together, the capsule and the glomerulus, that's together called the renal corpuscle. This is the first site where filtration happens. The blood is going to be filtered right here. Once the blood is filtered, so some of some of the components of blood, like the water and things that are dissolved in the water, some of those are going to be able to leak out of these capillaries, and they will make their way into the capsule right here. So the stuff that makes it through and into the capsule of the nephron, that is called the filtrate. Filtrate is just something that has already been filtered. It's the stuff that was able to make it through the filter onto the other side. So we will be talking a lot about filtrate and what happens with the filtrate. The filtrate that is produced right here at the glomerulus, that filtrate passes into this tube. See how it wraps back and forth? This is called a convoluted tubule. It's convoluted, just meaning it follows kind of a circuitous path. This is also more specifically referred to as the proximal convoluted tubule. In anatomy, proximal and distal are words that are used to refer to relative position. So if we're talking relative to the glomerulus, this tubule is proximal. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. It's kind of close to the glomerulus. Relative to this other tubule over here, see this other convoluted tubule? This one's called the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so the filtrate passes into the proximal convoluted tubule, and then it's going to descend down in this section. This is called the loop of Henle. There's a descending limb and an ascending limb. They do different things. So that's why we're breaking it down so specifically. So filtrate passes through the loop of Henle and then back up into the distal convoluted tubule. From there, it gathers into a collecting duct. Each nephron has a collecting duct, and those collecting ducts merge together and drain into the calyx, the minor calyx that we saw a couple slides back. So that fluid that has been produced, the filtrate, once it's done being processed, that is urine. So urine gets emptied from the collecting duct into the calyx, which will drain into the pelvis of the kidney, the renal pelvis, and then out the ureter to the urinary bladder. So now that we kind of have the structure down, next step is to talk about the filtration. How does the blood actually get filtered by this structure?